Before I get going, let me just sort of give an apology here. I'm a little bit discombobulated. This is weird. I mean, if you guys, this is your first year at Mises U, you wouldn't know this, but the schedule is totally different. I mean, you have no idea of the amount of new services we're offering for you this year. It's really amazing. And one of the things that we change up is normally we do the sessions where everybody's in the same thing early on in the week, for the Monday and Tuesday, and then from Wednesday on, we just break up and you have like 3 possibly sessions going on simultaneously. And so in the early sessions of the week, people are supposed to dress up and have a coat and tie because that's being broadcast to everybody and donors might be tuning in, whatever. But then later on, when we're just off in little classrooms, it gets more casual normally during the week. And so for me to be here on Thursday wearing the suit, I'm out of place. I mean, normally at Mises U, by Thursday, you're lucky if I'm still in a Speedo, okay? So this is very strange. So I am in a Speedo, but just there's a suit on. Okay, so obviously what I'm talking about, market for security. Before I'm going to get into that stuff, but I want to make the statement, because a lot of people know that I personally am a pacifist, and for various moral reasons, but also just strategically, I do think that if you want to change the world and you think that there's these powerful forces arrayed against you, I don't think that it's smart to say, let's take on the federal government with guns. I think that they're gonna, they have the comparative advantage. I think they're better at using violence than we would be. And so so for various, like I said, moral and strategic reasons, I do think that people really should consider the efficacy of violence, and is that really the way you want to go? Couldn't you achieve more, even against governments and trying to effect political change, using civil disobedience and things like that with some of these people from history that obviously were very influential, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to say, if only they had been willing to, gouge people in the eye or stab someone, they would have gotten so much more accomplished with their lives, right? You wouldn't say that about these people. So, but now having said that, so then people say, well, how can you be a pacifist and then do all your stuff writing about private security and talking about the market for surface-to-air missiles and all that kind of, because don't go, we're going to get into the fun stuff about blowing stuff up in a minute. But, so people say, how can you talk about that? Aren't you being a hypocrite? And just so you know, for those of you considering going into Austrian economics and libertarianism as a career, or I guess it's a vocation, Joe would want me to say, people, every other day, you're going to get someone calling you a hypocrite. I mean, that's just it goes with the job description. For some reason, everything you say, you're a hypocrite based on your views over here. So here, that's what people say, and that doesn't even make any sense to me, that no, as an economist, I can talk about market forces and say if we did have a free market in police services, judicial services, military defense, then this is the way things would unfold, and it would be a lot more efficient than giving a government monopoly in those areas. Just like I can talk about the case for legalizing drugs as an economist, and then if someone found out that I don't do heroin, they'd say, you're such a hypocrite, Bob. Right? So you get the analogy. I don't need to beat that to death. Okay. So what's interesting, I think, is that actually the case for private defense is a piece of cake. That's really not what trips people up. Really, when people give you all these zingers about, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if there's 18 midgets who are armed with broadswords and they jump off of a plane? And what happens is, a lot of the times it boils down to really what the issue is they can't get how private law could work. And that's really what the stumbling block is. And that admittedly is a much more difficult problem. But I think once you see how that system could work, just in terms of having society or the consensus emerging within a group of people to say who is the aggressor here, who's the lawbreaker, or what is the law, and how do we determine who's law-abiding and who's a criminal, that's really the hard part, to say how could you do that without some monopoly agency that arrogates it to itself the right to make such pronouncements, and then the rest of us just have to fall into line. If you don't have a single group vested with that authority to do that, it's a lot more difficult to understand, to just picture how could that work, because everyone just kind of automatically assumes you need to have such a single group with the ability to do that in order to promulgate laws. So, like I say, I think a lot of these issues that trip people up in terms of private defense or just private police forces and so on, it's really an issue of private law. So I would say keep them separate. They're different problems. There was one issue of how do we determine what property rights are? How do we determine who's a criminal, who's not? How do we determine what the lawful use of self-defense is and things like that? And then once you know that, then it's just a matter of people contracting that out. If you have the legal right to go use force to get your television set back because you think someone stole it from you, well, then it's to say, well, I'm actually a 98-pound weakling, I'm going to go hire someone else to do it. That's not really an issue. And you can totally see how, the market would be more efficient there if there was competing agencies hiring out burly guys to go get your television set as opposed to you have to go to the monopoly government that does that for you, right? So the issue is the definition of legal rights and so forth and what your redress is in case you think someone's violated your rights. That's the hard part. You get that solved and then just enforcing those rules by having competing agencies trying to get your patronage, that's nothing. So let me just spend a few minutes then talking about this issue. How would private law work? Well, I think the conceptual thing is to separate out the enforcement of it from the decision making, the rendering of decisions. And so there's a clue when you say, what does a judge do? A judge gives his or her opinion on something, and that's now how you hear reports about the Supreme Court. And he wrote the majority opinion, and he wrote the dissenting opinion, and we use that term opinion to be associated with judges and what they do. But I think we just take it for granted and say, oh yeah, that's a judge's opinion. But I take that word literally. I really think that you should consider it as a literal thing, that what the judge is saying is, in my opinion, looking at my knowledge of precedent, looking at my knowledge of the facts of this case and my intuitive sense of justice or whatever, I think the correct ruling in this case would be such and such. That's my opinion. And that's really all that a private judicial system is doing, is it's people who are experts in various types of cases. When disputes arise between people and they can't solve it on their own, they take that dispute to a third party. And how do they pick that person? In a free society, it's not because a bunch of guys with guns say, if anyone has a dispute in this area, then you get assigned this person, and this person's going to tell you who's right and who's wrong. Obviously, that's not the way it works in a free society. In a free society, people can't decide, there's an argument, they then say, well, we can't work this out, let's take it to somebody, and the person they're going to take it to is going to have a reputation for fairness and objectivity and knowing the law in that particular area. Right? So that's I think, the way 99% of judicial issues would be resolved in a free society, is that people would take it voluntarily. Both sides would agree beforehand to go to this particular person that they might call a judge. Nowadays, in our society, we would think, that's arbitration. And that's exactly what happens on arbitration. Both people, if someone's going through a divorce or some business and an employee, the business fires the employee and the employee says, no, that wasn't right. You owe me wages that you didn't pay me. And the business says, no, we don't. And they can't work it out. They don't want to take it to a government court because it'll just take forever. And so they can both agree beforehand, all right, let's go to some arbitrator and just deal with this because we need to move on. This is costly for both of us to have this up in the air. We have to resolve this dispute. We're not going to settle it by arm wrestling. We're not going to settle it, by having a duel, because that's crazy. We're going to, it's bad for business, and also you might get shot. So what we're going to do instead is take it to an arbitrator. And it's not that, then we're in trouble. Everyone knows that the arbitrators always rule in favor of the business. Well, no, that's not true, because if it were true, then the employees would never agree to that, right? So there is a market for an actually objectively fair arbitration process. So let me just give you some quick analogies, because a lot of people think that, no, that's impossible. What you're describing can't exist. But we see that sort of thing all the time in different areas. So like if you're talking about scientific journals, for example, how is it that good science is promulgated? And of course, if there's government funding and things, that messes it up. But in the original spirit, and how would it be in a free society, there wouldn't have to be just some group of people called the physicists, and then they get to determine who the other physicists are using force, and they have a monopoly. That's not the way it would work. Someone would come along and try to publish a paper and submit it for peer review and so on, and the other physicists in the field would decide whether they thought it was good or not. And it's hard to actually put your finger on who is determining who the right physicists are, who the best physicists are. You'd say, well, the people in the field are, but how do they get to be in the field? Well, because the other physicists let them in. So it's an odd process, but I think we can all agree, especially in a free society, it's not that physics would be arbitrary. It's not that the people who would be getting accolades and would be teaching at the top schools would be a bunch of fools and wouldn't know anything about the laws of nature better than the average Joe. No, those people would be experts in that area, and it wouldn't be arbitrary, and yet there would be no monopoly the way the government right now has a monopoly on judicial rulings. I'll just give you one more example. Especially in a free society, but even right now, who determines what words mean? Who defines words? And people might say, a very superficial answer would be to say, oh, the publishers of dictionaries, they define what words are. But no, they don't. If Webster's came out with a new edition and said that the word up, UP, means moving towards the floor, we wouldn't just all walk around saying, oh, I guess I was mistaken. No, we would say they put the wrong definition in. What are they doing? And if they did that a lot and we kept finding those mistakes, people would stop buying from Webster's and they'd go out of business. Right? So what the publishers of dictionaries do is codify the definitions that prevail in the community. Right? So they don't get to invent what the words mean, they just codify it. And then you could say, well, wait a minute, but then what's the role of having a dictionary? What's the point of having a dictionary in the first place if they're just writing down what we already know? And again, you see like these superficial things that might be objections to private law, but you can see in the case of dictionaries that that's silly. No, dictionaries serve a very useful function because a lot of us don't know exactly what words mean, or we think we know what they mean and we use it in a certain way, and then you look it up and say, oh my gosh, I've been using this word wrong for 20 years, right? That's happened to me before. You use a certain word in a way, and because you use it in one sense where it works, but then you try to apply it somewhere else and you realize that actually it didn't carry over because you go look up the actual definition. So the point is, we collectively as English speakers know what those words mean. The community somehow knows, but yet not everyone is an expert on it. There are some people that's what they do. They specialize in knowing the definitions of English words, and they are the ones who write dictionaries. Or it's even more compelling in the case of grammar books or style books for writers. And you can look up and say, oh yeah, I shouldn't say firstly, I should say first when I start the sentence or whatever. So the point is there are rules of grammar. They're not completely arbitrary. It's not that you can just say whatever you want because, hey, there's no such thing as real language or there's no rules of language. No, there are rules, but there's also a sense in which we decide what they are. The English we speak now is different from the time when Shakespeare wrote. So the definitions of words and the grammar has evolved over time. So there is a sense in which we decide what the words are and what the rules are, but in another sense, anyone who tries to deviate from that is an oddball and is violating the rules of grammar. Okay, so I think that's a good analogy in some respects for how private law works in general, that there would be people codifying certain principles, right? So there would be a role for people writing like theoretical books on this is the way the law ought to look in a just society. So, Rothbard could have a natural law approach. Utilitarians might put their views out. Other people could put different things. And then the judges would render opinions, would give opinions when cases are brought before them, perhaps drawing on those various strands that they think are relevant. And then the market would determine which judges got more cases brought to them. And they also would probably rely a lot on precedent and case law because clients would want to have some inkling before they went into the case of how is this guy going to rule, right? That if the company's having the dispute with the employee and saying, we think we paid you what we owe you, and the employee says, no, because you said you were going to give me bonus and you didn't, they wouldn't want to, if they went to an arbitrator and then they got in there and he said, okay, the way we're going to solve this is to see who can chug this beer faster, go, right? They would be stunned, and they said, that's not the way you ruled on previous case. We thought you were going to rule on this the way, So the point is, you would want predictability going into it. So it would be in the judge's interest to have standards to say things like these are the rules of evidence. You can't use hearsay, or maybe you can use hearsay with these exceptions. So a lot of the stuff that that if you go into law, the things that seem natural and just to us, there would still be a role for that. It's just the way it would manifest itself is the judge would have to provide a service to attract people so that both sides would be willing to submit to the judge beforehand, going into it. Okay, so then, of course, the question is, all right, that's fine for like civil disagreements and so, but what about actual crimes? How would that work? And so here I'll start bringing in now the issue of actual enforcement of the law too. So I'm driving home, I see some guy breaking into my house and he runs out with the TV, and I get it. So he gets away before I can stop him. And I see him run out, and I'm pretty sure it's the guy from down the street. I can't stand that guy, and I just know he's a criminal, right? So I'm pretty sure he's the guy that took my TV. And so I go down to his house the next day, and I accuse him of it. I say, give me my TV back. I can look in there and see it. It's a TV that looks just like mine. And he says, you're nuts. I've had this for 3 months, whatever. So we can't resolve it. Now, let's say I'm absolutely certain that that's my TV. You might say, especially from a Rothbardian point of view, you might say that I'm perfectly morally justified in just marching in and taking that TV. And if this guy is a tough guy, or like he's got a pit bull or something, you might even go further and say I'm justified in calling up a bunch of buddies to come shoot the dog and take the television set, bind the guy or whatever, not kill him, but do what I need to do to get my TV. You might even go that far and say, well, it's his fault. He aggressed against me. I can do the least amount of damage to him to get my TV back for sure. And that's his own fault if he's putting obstacles in my way. So my point is, whatever your views on that issue are, that's irrelevant, because the community is not going to like me doing that. They're not going to like people just unilaterally saying, this guy's a criminal, he took my TV, I'm dead certain, and so I'm going to get a bunch of my buddies and break down his door and shoot his dog and take the television set. Right? That's not a neighborly thing to do. My employer's not going to like that. They're going to say, yeah, we heard that you're breaking down, what are you doing? So you get the point, that it's just not smart to do that. So rather than do that, I'm going to want to have a professional agency come to people that are trained. They might have guys that are burly guys with bulletproof stuff on, and flak jackets and things, and like maybe the plastic stuff that the police use, the riots use, so that they can be, and that they would have non-lethal means, like they would have nets and foam guns and stuff like that. Right? They wouldn't come in with guns blazing to get a TV, because that would be reckless. There would be no reason to escalate it to that level. Okay, so you would do that, but then even there, the private agent, the enforcement agencies, again, they wouldn't just take my word for it. They couldn't just say, yep, whoever comes in here and is willing to plunk down the money, we'll go and get TVs for you and break down doors and give them to you, right? That'd be crazy, because how do they know whether that really is the TV or the right person's TV? So those agencies would say, before we act on your behalf, you have to bring us an opinion from a reputable judge saying, ruling in your favor. So what I have to do in this case, I say to my neighbor, hey, that's my TV. He says, no, it's not. And I said, well, then prove it. Show me the receipt if you said you bought it 3 months ago. And he said, I don't have it. I said, well, what store did you buy it from? I'll go ask them if it's in their records. And he said, no, I paid cash from some guy in the street. Sorry. Right? He's just making up, all these convenient excuses. And then I can say, all right, and I'm telling all my neighbors, this guy stole my TV. They're, oh, really? And so I challenge him, and I say, look, here, and I come up with a list of a bunch of reputable arbitrators who specialize in burglary and so forth, and say, here you go. Here's a list of 20 people within 15 minutes of driving. I'm willing to take our case to any one of them, and then I will agree with whatever that arbitrator decides, because I think I have a strong case against you. And then, maybe I have a security camera and so forth. Maybe I have a bunch of circumstantial evidence. Maybe I'm saying, just let's look at the serial number on your TV, because I have the receipt from when I bought it, and I'm telling you that's my TV, but he won't let me in his house to look at the serial number. All right, so I do that, and then if he just says, no, I don't, these arbitrators are all a bunch of scoundrels, let's use my brother-in-law. He's fair, right? Take it or leave it. If he does, if he's acting like that, my neighbors are going to start to say, okay, Bob is in the right, this guy stole his TV. And maybe, and so I'll say, well, since you're being ridiculous, I'm going to go to one of these professional arbitrators who hears 30 cases like this a week, and there's never been an issue of them taking bribes or anything, and they've given rulings, and they always explain why they ruled the way they did, in the ruling, and it's, no other legal theorist or scholar has ever thought these people did anything outrageous. Their colleagues think, oh, these guys are women are good judges. So I'm going to just pick one of them, since you're not being helpful here, and I'm going to take my case and we're going to try it, and if you don't show up, tough for you. And then that judge may decide that, okay, so the guy doesn't do that, and so I take it to some judge, reputable judge, and I'll probably take it to somebody who's got a reputation for being really hard on criminals, and so then the judge makes the ruling, and he says, yep, I agree, this guy stole your TV. Okay, so now I go back to the enforcement agency, the company that hires a bunch of goons to come in, and I show them that, oh, Judge Hoppe has ruled in favor of this. Like I show them, and I've given notice to the other guy saying there's now this pending ruling where a judge agrees you took my TV. Do you want to dispute that? And he says, no, that guy Hoppe is crazy, blah, blah, blah. All right. So at that point now, I go to that security agency and say, look, I don't want to go into this guy's house by myself. I need, you call in the big guns. And they say, okay, sure. And then he comes in. All right. and he comes and gets the TV. All right, so you get the point, though, that what I'm getting at here is that I think you need to disentangle the issue of how is it decided that it has been a crime or not, and then once that's an issue and there's no doubt, so the community's not going to think that Guido is a criminal. They're not going to look at him going into a house and coming out with a TV and saying, oh my gosh, he's a criminal, because for one thing, he's going to be doing it in broad daylight. He's going to have a big van with his number, call us if some looter takes your stuff, we hate looters, and he's going to be very professional. Like I said, he's going to have a lot of body armor and stuff like. Well, he doesn't need it, but you know the point. So, and he's not. And the crucial thing is, he's not going to kill the guy. He's probably not even going to hurt him. Like they may incapacitate him, like put a net on him or some of those things, and they. So you get the point. Because it would be bad for business. You might say, well, no, they have the right to do it. Like if they go in there and that guy comes in with a kitchen knife, they can shoot him in the head. Maybe morally you think they have the right to do it, but that would be bad for business. No one's going to want to hire them again because that's just a nightmare. It's a bad, to say, oh, some guy took my TV, I hired some guys to get it back, and the guy ended up dead. That's in his own house. That doesn't sound good, right? So it'd be much better if they go in and incapacitate the person. Whether like maybe they knock out a window and shoot in tear gas and make the guy leave the house first. And they of course would have checked before to make sure there's not like an infant sleeping or something. The point is they would be much more careful because there's competition. Because if they kept doing stuff like that and we got to get tough on these criminals and Guido feared for his life. No, well, okay, maybe he would be exonerated, but he wouldn't get any more business. All right, so that's the idea that the stuff we associate with police brutality now, and you see these. It is just shocking. I don't know if you guys look at this stuff, but no matter how much a police officer overreacts to something, like whether it's a 13-year-old in a school who mouths off and he just beats the heck out of the kid and tackles him and breaks his nose, people always say in the comments of those news articles stuff like, well, these police are putting their lives on the line every day. And they could do anything, literally anything, and there would be people who just rush to their defense. So my point is, that happens because it's a monopoly. People think they have to choose between having law enforcement or not. And then, well, if we have to have it, then sometimes people, they overreact and whatever, but that's just the cost of living in a society of laws. And no, it's not. That's the cost of living in a society with one group that has a monopoly on law enforcement. Okay, let me just take a minute talking about this interesting question. Would there be prisons in a free society? Yes, there would. Oh, right. I was wondering what you guys are laughing at. Okay. Don't worry, this will make sense in a minute. So, I think thus far everything I've said, most of the anarcho-capitalists would agree with that, with this stuff. Here, this is my own particular idiosyncratic take, so I just want you to be aware of that you can be an anarchist and disagree or have different views of things. The way I picture law enforcement working in a modern, westernized, capitalistic society is that for most people, especially the wealthier they were, if they live in a suburban community where people kind of know each other especially, I think one of the ways that you would supplement just the stuff I talked about before, about just randomly interacting with people and then taking your disputes to a judge, I think that would all be supplemented by people sort of unilaterally making pledges to the community at large, saying, if I agree, I agree that if I'm convicted of any of these types of offenses, I will pay out such and such in terms of monetary penalties. And then I'm a member of this larger group with financial resources, so I'm good for it. And at first that might sound odd to you, but that's what we do with driving right now, and that's what surgeons do. All right, so when you drive around right now, if you're insured, you get into a car accident. If you're at fault, okay, you owe the other person. Let's say you owe them $500,000. Like if you kill somebody, you can say, well, gee, I don't have $500,000, but you're insured, and so your insurance company pays them, even though you were at fault. You could say the insurance company, they didn't do it, but that's the point. You pay premiums to them, partly not only because your car might get totaled and you need to get it fixed, but also if you cause an accident and are at fault, you're not going to have the money to pay that huge settlement. The same thing, a surgeon, if the surgeon screws up and kills somebody on the operating table, and especially if it's concluded that they did something really bad, it wasn't just, that it was a tough operation, but no, they botched it, and are legally responsible for killing that person, you say, oh, I owe the estate $1 million. Well, the surgeon might not have it, but that's what they have malpractice insurance for. Okay, so I'm saying take that logic and extend it. I'm saying I think it's possible that in a society, at least a certain type of society, you might see things like that where I apply for a job somewhere and they say, well, what association are you a part of? And then if I tell them that they could trust it, they say, okay, because what's happening is this group that I'm a part of vouches for me. And they say, you hire him, and then one day you show up to work and all your inventory has been cleaned out and Bob's in Mexico drinking tequila shots with all your stuff. Well, then we will pay you for it because we had been vouching for him. And so, yeah, we'll do that. And then maybe we'll try to go get Bob and recover the stuff. But that company's made whole right away by the association of which I was a part. So why do they do that? Because I pay them dues or premiums or whatever you want to call it. And of course, they're only going to let me in if they look at my history and see that, okay, I don't have a violent history or such and such. Just like a life insurance company is going to charge different premiums to people, or some people they're not going to insure at all if they have a brain tumor and things like that. Whereas if they're a smoker, they'll charge a higher premium but still give them a policy. But if they are, have a brain tumor and skydive every Tuesday, they might say, we're not giving you a policy at all because that's just so risky. So the same token here, I think you would see that kind of mechanism play out to supplement the stuff I was talking about earlier. So now, just keep that logic going through. So let's say the really crazy cases, like some guy, axe murder or something like that. And then they catch the guy, they capture him, he's still alive. They take him, the judges rule and say, yeah, this guy, he killed 16 people with an axe. That's kind of unusual. What do you have to say for yourself? And he explains and says, wow, so what do we do with this person? And I'm saying I think there would be a role for companies that would offer things, places, buildings where people like that could not just be out in the community because no association would vouch for that person. No one's going to say, sure, I promise that if this person does something criminal, we'll pay you for it because they said this guy just killed 16 people with an axe. This guy's crazy. We can't do that. So what do you do? Well, a company might say, hey, we will vouch for him, but only if we, take him into our possession and he stays in this building and we have, cameras and things like that and we can keep him here. And that person, you'd say, well, why would the point is the person would agree to it though, because you could explain to them, no, you're not going to be able to walk around freely because the owners of the private roads and the malls and the people who have businesses, they're not going to let you onto their property. That you're a pariah right now. You have this outstanding settlement against you. You killed these 16 people, and the judge has ruled that you owe their estates $1 million apiece, something like that. So what are you going to do? The point is the person, could come into this area and then you can work from here. Maybe the person is a brilliant engineer or something. He can't just be out free, but maybe having a controlled environment doing that. So the reason I'm saying it's like a hotel is these things would be competing for each other. If there is a market for that, if there are some criminals that are just really antisocial enough that they just can't be out, I think the humane market solution might be that companies would build these things. And the reason I'm depicting it as a hotel is that they would try to attract them because the point is the landowners would say, get off my property. So they would have, they wouldn't be able to stand anywhere. They would end up in the ocean and drown, except these people say, you can come onto our property if you abide by these rules. We're going to search you, of course, before you get here, make sure you don't have any shivs on you or anything like that. We're going to, maybe shave your head and you got to do all these things, wear this jumpsuit and whatever, and submit to what you think are humiliating procedures. But those are the rules if you want to come here. But other than that, it's not going to be that they're going to, the stuff that happens in prison right now, none of that would happen because people would just choose a different prison, right? So yes, you would be in there and you would be unfree to leave, but the point is the guards wouldn't be sadistic and you wouldn't be doing crazy things like making license plates, and you also wouldn't be probably, getting into talking to other criminals and then learning how to do stuff and then getting out later and then committing worse crimes, which is what happens right now in the criminal justice system. All right, so I am calling it a hotel, but of course, the people that are vouching for you, so there's a group saying, okay, yeah, we'll vouch for this person, but you say, but you got to come in here. They're going to want to make sure the person doesn't get out. So it's going to be an odd sort of hotel. It's going to be like the Hotel California when you get in there, okay? So But the point is that you see, like it's inefficient, like to execute somebody from a purely utilitarian, pragmatic sense. If the person, it could be productive and could be rehabilitated, then that's kind of a waste. And so I think in a market society, a free society, over time, even if it's true that the victims' families had the legal right to kill the person, I think the person might be able to buy that off of them. You know, like there could be mutually voluntary arrangements or agreements where the person says, yeah, you have the right to kill me right now because I killed your father or something, and you're the legal heir of his estate. You have the moral right to kill me because I did that. But how about I go to this thing and work 20 years? You know, let's say the guy's let's say he's 50. I'm probably going to live another 50 years. What if I go here and I give you 80% of my income? How do you feel about that? And then I think over time that would become the socially acceptable response. So yes, you could say, no, I want this person dead if you wanted to. That would be your legal right. But I think over time, more and more people would view that as sort of sadistic and, that's not going to bring your dad back. Why don't you just let bygones be bygones? And I think in that sort of society, you would see less crime in the long run because, I don't want to sound cliched, but the cycle of violence would be minimized. That would be teaching, kids would see in our very civilized society, even when someone goes crazy and kills people with an axe, what do? Well, we contain him so he can't hurt anybody else. And there wouldn't ever be prison breaks from these things because these would be, these people would be on the line if someone escaped. It's not like the politicians who really don't suffer if someone breaks out of a prison that's in their jurisdiction. And then so we contain them, and then they're productive, and they probably would be rehabilitated, or there would be a much better chance of rehabilitating the people there, especially if it was just, they were on drugs or something. If there was some issue going on when they did all that stuff, there's a much better chance that they would be rehabilitated through that process legitimately. And then even there, when you talk about parole, how would parole work? Well, if people run that association said, okay, we actually think this person's reformed, he's expressed genuine contrition or whatever, they might then say, okay, we'll let him go out. We are the association vouching for him, and they would charge much higher premiums, and they're on the hook. If he does go back and go back to his criminal past, or criminal ways, then they're paying for it. So there would be the possibility of parole. I think, think through the logic of what would get you in prison in the first place, how would you get out, is when people thought, yeah, I'm willing to vouch for you so you can go get back among society. But again, the incentives would be there for them to make the right decision, whereas now the people on the prison parole boards who make decisions, if they're wrong and the person goes out and kills somebody, that doesn't mean they lose $100,000 next year, right? It just means, they might feel bad. But the point is here, if you screw up and vouch for someone who actually goes back and falls into recidivism, then you financially lose, or your company does. All right, well, let's start talking about the real fun stuff, about blowing things up. How would what we think of as military defense, how would that work? Well, I think most anarcho-capitalists think that insurance companies would play a major role in this area. So let me just give you the basics of it. So I don't know if you can see that, but that's supposed to be the Prudential. Where's my laser pointer? Oh, there it is. Over there. So the idea is, let's say you got a big city and their owners, the people who own the big buildings, the skyscrapers. And so they take out insurance for things like, what if there's a fire? So they take out fire insurance. What if there's, other sorts of disasters that could strike? They might have various types of insurance policies. And then you say, well, what if bombers fly overhead and drop bombs and blow up our skyscraper? That would kind of be a pain. And so you say, well, how do we, just like a fire would be devastating, that would be devastating if foreign bombers took out our skyscraper and ruined our property. So they could go to Prudential and take out large policies against that, saying, in the case that our property is damaged because of foreign military action, you indemnify us. So now, Prudential has, if you know the economics lingo, has internalized the externalities there. If they have policies from a large group of clients in the same region, now dollar for dollar, Prudential is suffering the loss from anything that happens to any of their clients. So it's now in Prudential's interest. They could say, well, what if so they might be on the hook potentially, let's say, for $1 billion. Like if some foreign army comes up or Air Force comes in and just starts carpet bombing our city, we're going to be out $1 billion. And And then you could run the numbers and say, what's the chance of that happening? And well, that they're not too hostile or they're this hostile and they're foreign, that the leaders are making really aggressive speeches saying that we stole their land or whatever. And it looks like they're trying to drum up their own population in a pretext to invade. This isn't good. We're just sitting ducks right here. So what could they do? They say, well, we're on the hook for $1 billion. If we just spent a few $100 million, we could really make it hard for them to do that. We could buy surface-to-air missiles. We could buy our own, enemy fighters or aircraft fighters. We could get radar installations. We could maybe get naval vessels that were putting out mines in case they're trying to send their navy in and so forth. So the point is, if you ran the numbers, they would be the ones who would actually be funding the purchase of military hardware, and they would be doing it in a competitive market. It wouldn't just be, if they could do it more cheaply, they would get to pocket the difference, is the point. Now, I don't think you would see huge standing armies, and they certainly wouldn't have swastikas, right? Just because that's bad for business. But especially if it's the Guido Hulsmann agency, that's just that, his marketing people would say. Right, so, and why wouldn't they have that? Is it just because I want to say, well, we want to make sure we don't end up like the Nazi? No, because just think of how ridiculously expensive that would be to have that huge of a workforce. It would be much more efficient and cost-effective, I think, to have a smaller group of professionals who were supplemented with extraordinary capital goods and tools and equipment, and that was the way they would repel the hordes of incoming invaders if that's what a state was going to throw against them. All right, now on this point, let me just go off on a little bit of a tangent. As an economist, I really think the way warfare is treated in the popular imagination, even like in things where we're supposed to be rooting for these guys, it's just crazy. Like a few years ago, it was really rampant where there were all these Hollywood blockbusters showing, the movie would be building up, and then at the end there would be these grand epic battles where you'd have thousands of people on this side and thousands of people on this side, and then they just go, oh, and they run at each other. And I'm just thinking the best you can do with the thousands of incredibly productive people on your side, those resources that are like computers and very creative things, is to say, let's all just sprint into a wall of swords. That's crazy. That is just the stupidest thing imaginable, right? In terms of, if you, especially like in the Civil War, the war between the states, the War of Northern Aggression, whatever you want to call it, on paper, the southern states should have easily been able to survive. They should have easily fended off the invasion from the north. And if you wanted, how did they lose? Well, look what they did. They went around and basically at gunpoint rounded up all their able-bodied men and then said, okay, you see these cannons? Let's go. If you were a spy sent by Lincoln to destroy the fighting power of the Confederacy, what better thing could you do than to say, okay, we could just do guerrilla warfare. We could just take pot shots at their commanding officers and then run away like we did in the Revolutionary War against the British. Or we could all get into a single file line, put on nice bright colors to make sure they know who we are, and then march at them and maybe yell stuff at them, and maybe that'll work. That's crazy, just marching into their guns. That's crazy when they're clearly more better equipped than we are. Right, so the point is that the conventional warfare, the type of warfare in which states engage, that's crazy, and I don't think in a free society you would see us copying their methods, only it would be private. I think we would do things completely differently. It would be like, I think, the Vietnam War, except the technological roles would be reversed. Right, so you would have the invading state would have all these big bombs and have all kinds of troops and stuff, whereas the resistance would be guerrilla warfare, doing all these sorts of decentralized things that was hard to fight, except the anarchist society, would other things equal, be a lot more technologically advanced. And so I think when you see government, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to have a slide at the end about this stuff. Okay, oops, I skipped one point here. Down here, what about public goods? I just want to mention, when you bring this stuff up to academic economists, they think they have a trump card. They say, no, military defense is the epitome of a public good. It can't be provided in the private sector. Right? By a public good, they mean that once you provide it, you can't exclude others from being able to use it. And also, one person's enjoyment of it doesn't detract from somebody else's enjoyment of it. So if you you build this SAM site here, and that deters the enemy from coming in because they know, oh, we're going to lose a lot of our fighter pilots and our pilots for the bombers, and so it's not worth us going in there. well, what if people could decide, well, we're not going to pay Prudential. We're not going to be part of their company anymore because we're just going to sit back and enjoy this public good. So that is an issue, but in practice, I think that it's overblown. That it's not, that military defense actually is a lot more of a private good than people normally think of. So especially for things like protecting shipping. Like if you're trying to ship merchandise across the ocean and you need to have a convoy of military vessels to provide an escort, clearly, if the people in the convoy aren't paying for it, you can just not protect them, right? So you can clearly exclude service there. Now, yeah, if you're going to have something like ICBMs and that's how you're going to deter a Soviet invasion, that it's kind of hard to restrict it to the paying customers versus you can't protect this half of the city from getting nuked and not protect that half. If you're going to protect the city from an incoming nuclear bomb, everyone's protected. That is true, but a lot of stuff in military defense isn't quite like that. Another example, if you have enemy troops marching, then clearly the people on the border of your region have to be paying customers. Otherwise, you would just pull back your own forces, further and let those outliers just get eaten up by the incoming hordes, right? So the point is, yeah, there is some slipperiness, and it's a public good in some respects, but it's not, if you actually think through the logic of it, it's not really as clear-cut as a standard economics textbook would have you believe. Okay. Wouldn't warlords take over? Now, I have a Mises.org article with that title, so if you are interested in this, I would recommend that you read this. So if you just Google Robert Murphy, wouldn't warlords take over, it'll be one of the top hits. Walter Block has told me, I don't remember his exact words, but something like, this is one of the single best pieces on private military defense he's ever read, and I kind of have to agree with him. It's really... You remember the scene from A Christmas Story when little Ralphie's reading his essay over? He's like, oh, wow, that's great. That's kind of how I felt reading this. So, let me just very quickly, what are the points here? What you need to do is compare apples to apples, right? So, yes, it is possible, and we've seen historically, there can be regions where there's no state and a libertarian utopia doesn't emerge next Tuesday, right? That's clear. That happens. So no one's making the claim that anytime you have the absence of a state, all these market forces are going to kick in and everyone's just going to have these voluntary, peaceful society just pop out. But the point is usually where we see this happen is a region that used to have a government that descended into civil war. And that's why it's the mess it is now. So it's not that the people had a government and then they were all reading Rothbard and said, oh my gosh, and then their government just dissolved away. That's not what happened. They were all still statists, and they started trying to kill each other because they wanted to seize control of the government, and then no one group was strong enough, and the government fell, and now they're all fighting each other. Okay, so that is hardly an argument against anarcho-capitalism, and moreover, you could just easily cite that and say, well, that's why you can't have a government or a state, because look, sometimes it descends into civil war, right? So it's interesting that these alleged case studies in Rothbardism are actually cases of failed states. So you just say, well, that's what happens when you try to set up a government. If the balance of power shifts, it might devolve into civil war. So what the claim is that take any group of people, whatever their level of peacefulness and their ability to to compromise and to not use violence and so forth to settle disputes, and we're saying it's less likely that there's going to be warfare if you disperse the power, that you're more likely to see aggression and so forth if you give one group all the guns or most of the guns and the authority to tell everyone else what to do, and then there's this ideological background where everyone else thinks, yep, these people are in charge, and they can take as much of our money as they want, and they have a monopoly on these things, that actually is a recipe for disaster. And so, again, it doesn't matter what your view of human nature is, whether you think people are angels or whether you think they're devils. The point is having a group given a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, that seems like a very dangerous thing in either case. So just to follow this train of thought a little bit more, what happens is that people will say, to make the case for a limited government, they'll say, well, if you got a group of people in a state of anarchy and they're all patronizing different competing judicial agencies or defense agencies, and people have different views initially. Like some people believe in capital punishment, some people don't. Some people think abortion's murder, some people don't think it is. Some people, think that if you violate certain religious laws, you should get your hand chopped off. Other people think that's crazy. So you got all these people in a pressure cooker, and if you just had anarchy, the way you guys are talking about, they would just be duking it out, and perhaps as a matter of prudence, you're right. Maybe the agencies wouldn't necessarily be shooting each other all the time, but there would be no rule of law. It would just be real hostile, and it would just be groups always at each other's throats, and maybe just not attacking out of prudence. But that's not the kind of world I want to live in. Instead, let's form a government where we all agree. Yet we have these different viewpoints of what the just society looks like, but let's have periodic elections, and we all agree we're not going to contest it. As long as it's a fair election, we all abide by the rules. We're going to elect a government to implement these views, to try to build a consensus. And if people don't like it, they can elect somebody else the next cycle, okay? But we're going to not use violence to settle these disputes, and that's the role. That's why we have a limited state, and that's the argument. So what I'm going to say is, if you have a society that's capable of doing that, and for one thing, that's no state ever actually emerged in that nice, peaceful, voluntary fashion, but if it did, I'm saying that population that's so virtuous enough to be able to do that, why, when they're in a state of anarcho-capitalism, why would they be patronizing defense agencies that were shooting each other up? If you're willing to say, yeah, I realize I have fundamentally different views from you, you think abortion's fine, I think it's murder, but let's, I'm not going to physically attack you, let's vote and try to settle it at the ballot box. If you're that reasonable of a person, why then wouldn't you also say, okay, I see we have legitimate differences, so I'm not going to pay money to a private security agency that goes and tackles you when you go into an abortion clinic, because I recognize that even though I think you're wrong, I understand you don't think that that's murder, and so I'm not going to patronize a defense agency that's just going to be real provocative, and I can see that that's not good in the long run if we're having our agencies fight each other over this issue. Okay, so the point is, you can say, oh, that's not realistic, but then why can we settle at the ballot box? So my point is just a society that can compromise and settle things peacefully, even though there's legitimate and serious disagreement on really important issues, through the ballot box. Why couldn't they do that much more effectively through the market, where there's not all the other problems that go along with government democracy? Okay, then the last objection I'll entertain, and I'll answer a few of your questions. Wouldn't a neighboring state invade? So I've already given a little bit of my answer here, so let me just mention a few points. One thing is, I think a crucial point, people say, oh man, the government would have so many advantages. A neighboring state would have so many advantages that the free society wouldn't. They could engage in a draft, they could conscript a lot of people so they could throw a lot more manpower at us. They can tax their own people and raise a lot more revenue than the insurance companies could do in the private analog, the next door society that's relying on purely voluntary means. And so even though it's not fair, it's undeniable that, that neighboring state, if it wanted to, could just steamroll over us because they could just throw so many more resources at us. So there's a couple things. One is, other things equal, the anarchist society that's a free society of the kind we're envisioning is going to be phenomenally wealthy. So even if it's true that they can only devote 1% of their output to military defense, whereas the neighboring state devotes 50% of their output to defense, even on its own terms, that it doesn't follow, therefore, that the defender is going to be at a loss because they're going to be so much richer. The other thing is, governments notoriously don't spend their military funds wisely. So it's the amount that, like, the Pentagon spends to get fighter aircraft. I don't think a truly anarchist society that is buying planes to defend itself, military jets to defend itself, is going to spend the same amount, just because they're going to be more careful with their money. So the point is, the Pentagon overspends because it's a corrupt process where they're basically shoveling money to their buddies, and then they know when they leave the Pentagon they're going to get nice plush consulting contracts and things like that. So it's a big game as a way for them to take taxpayer money without literally just pocketing it when they're in office or when they're in the military. So you have that issue too, that don't be afraid of these big numbers, that it's not apples to apples. The other thing, and that's what the point of having a porcupine here, is that right now you think, oh man, look at how much the U.S. government spends on its military, but the U.S. government is trying to run the world. Right? They need to have aircraft carriers to be able to project force. That's what the History Channel always talks about, the U.S. military's ability to project force. And it's, project that force. So the point is that the anarchists wouldn't need to do that. They would just have to make it really inconvenient for someone to invade them, right? They don't need to be able to project force around the globe. They don't need to be able to bomb and take out some city 10,000 miles away. They don't have to have the ability. They just have to, so they don't need to have long-range bombers. They don't need to have things. They don't need to have submarines that can go around the world and can stay out at sea for 6 months at a time before, going to port and getting more food and all that kind of stuff. They just need to have submarines that can go out a little bit and try to shoot the enemy submarines that are trying to infiltrate their waters, or that can lay mines or whatever, right? So my point is that they could, for a lot less money, they could repel a military that on paper was a lot more expensive and do a good job of it. All right, so why don't I stop there and I'll turn it over to your, I'm sure, interesting thought experiments. Yeah. Will this ever happen? I don't know. I mean, it could. So we can always dream. Yeah. Did you like that answer? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so the question, in case you didn't hear it, was Hoppe, following Mises, has talked about the difference between events that are insurable and those that really aren't, and it's abusive language to say that we insured against this thing. And so he's asking, is it really true that insurance companies could provide these types of services? So here, I'm glad you brought that up. So again, let me just stress there is a difference in treatment here. I think just about everybody who subscribes to the Rothbardian view thinks that insurance companies would insure law-abiding people, and then if somebody aggresses against them, would then try to go get, pay them off, and then try to go get the bad guy. So like the stuff I was talking about, Prudential insuring the owners of skyscrapers, and then saying, well, we know if bombers come in and take it out, we have to pay them, so we're going to spend money to try to prevent that damage in the first place. I think everybody is on board with that, because that's, looks like you can have insurance against vandalism, or if someone comes and breaks into your house and steals things, you can be insured against that, and that's an example of human action doing this. So that was the answer. Now the thing where there is controversy is me saying, what if you're in a sense insuring yourself against being the criminal? And there a lot of people say, wait a minute, that's kind of weird. You can't, because you have control over whether you're a criminal or not. And so some people don't like that, me taking it that way, but most people agree you can insure against bad people doing stuff to you, because that is a quantifiable thing. So I understand what you're saying. If you want to say it isn't, that's fine, but they would just say, well, there's plenty of things right now where insurance companies insure you against stuff that ultimately other people are controlling. It's just not the policyholder isn't controlling it. Okay, maybe one more. Yep. Okay, so the question is, would I advocate, is that the verb? Would I advocate the execution of a criminal who is unwilling to work and wasn't insured, and just like, so he does something and the judge says, okay, you owe the estate $1 million, he doesn't have it, and he doesn't want to work, and then okay. Well, when you say would I advocate it, no, I personally would not, because I'm a pacifist, all right? But if you're saying, as an economist, would I predict, would that be the status of the law? Yeah, I think it would be like with people's conceptions of justice right now. I do predict if the world went anarcho-capitalist tomorrow, at least among Western societies, that yeah, I think people would say if somebody kills somebody in your family, you have the right to kill them if you want. And I do think some people would agree. I think some people wouldn't. Some people would just say, no, let's just move on, and that's just going to make it worse if we try to take revenge. But I think plenty of people would, and I do predict that would be legal. Well, okay, the question was, would the man just walk free? If it could be a woman. Let's not be sexist. Ladies, if you want to murder someone, girl power. So the question is, would the person just walk free? And this is the last point, and I'll let you guys go to dinner here, but this is a good segue into, I think, an important point. That's one of the neat things about having a private property society. Even if there is a crazy judicial ruling and everyone's like, oh my gosh, a murderer just walked, because let's say there's some technicality, the way the contracts were written somebody actually gets off with what everyone knows was a crime, or because he committed it against like some Amish people or something, and they just said, no, we forgive you, we're not going to press charges. So everyone knows that's a murderer walking around. The people who own the private roads could say, all right, well, you can't walk on my road. And the people who own the grocery stores, well, you can't shop here. And so the person would still be a pariah and would be shunted to the outskirts of society, even though technically we wouldn't have the legal ability to grab him. I mean, he could, if he owned his house and he might live in his house, and maybe the electricity company would still do business with him. But the point is, he would have his freedom restricted in the everyday sense of that term, even though technically he wasn't convicted of that crime. So that's the issue. All right, thanks everybody.